Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this very special occasion to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of Quentin Hughes, a war hero, architect, and historian. This idea of having a symposium in honor of Quentin was suggested to Palazzo Falson around a year ago by my former lecturer, Professor Conrad Thake, from the Art and Art History Department, the University of Malta, and Dr. Roger Vella Bonavita, who is today with us, and he came all the way from Australia. So thank you, Roger and Conrad. We have worked together to present a program of 8 short presentations prepared by a strong panel of scholars and professionals. Each presentation will touch on different aspects of this distinguished man who loved Malta, its historic architecture, and its people. We have prepared also a copy of the program, which you can follow, and the presentations will be delivered by Dr. Roger Vella Bonavita, Marquis de Piro, on behalf of Professor Richard England, and adding his own contribution. Perit, Anton Vassallo, Dr. Stephen Spiteri, Dr. Charles Azzopardi on behalf of photographer David Wrightson, Joseph Mizzi, Professor Conrad Thake, and myself. I wish to thank all the speakers for their contributions and cooperation, and our supporting partner, the Phoenicia Malta. I will kickstart the symposium with a letter from Quentin Hughes' daughters. The programs I was mentioning, and here we have a very sweet note from Carrie and Sean. And the message is this. Sean and I were thrilled to hear that once again Malta is recognizing and celebrating the contribution of our father, who made the restoration of Malta's outstanding architectural heritage a significant one. We are so sorry that we cannot be with you to share the day together, but I would like to say a few words about Dad, his love of Malta, its people, and of course, its military architecture. When we visited the island last year, for the first time in many years, we were overwhelmed at seeing Valletta looking so beautiful, thanks to the restoration of so many of its buildings, and above all, its magnificent fortifications. We have Dad's books to treasure and are proud that they take up so much space on our bookshelves. I even appear, this is Carrie saying, I even appear on the buildings of Malta in Fortress, the picture you're seeing behind me. Although Dad did point out that it was simply to get his perspectives right. Well, that was Dad. He used to profess he had 3 loves: Malta, Liverpool, and his dog Pebbles, though I don't think he ever said in which order. Last year, we spent a most enjoyable evening with Richard England and Conrad Thake, reminiscing about our time on the island, the house in Sijiwi, and the contribution he made as the island's first professor of architecture. I learned so much from Richard about Dad that night, because I must admit that as a teenager living in Malta in the 1970s, we were far more interested in music and boys than its architecture. But we were always very aware that his love of Malta and respect for its people was long-standing, unshakable, and heartfelt. Thank you so much for arranging today's symposium in his honor. In doing so, I do hope that you will remember not only his contribution to the island's heritage, but also his companionship, enjoyment of life, and wicked sense of humor. We are also honored today with the presence of Quentin's wife, Jo Hughes. So thank you for being here. I have prepared a short presentation in connection with Palazzo Falson. This is the involvement of our museum and this symposium. And we have a number of letters that were exchanged between Quentin and Olof Gollcher. The collection of letters are from the 1950s to the 1960s. And here I thank Jan Banderman, research volunteer at Palazzo Falson, who has helped me in the research on these letters. Although the collection, as I said, starts from the 1956, the friendship between Quentin and Olof started earlier. The first time that the name Quentin Hughes appeared in our archival records at Palazzo Falson is Olof's entry in his diary in 1950. The exact date of the appointment was 27th April 1950 at 9:30. This is the appointment he had with Quentin Hughes, and he's listed as lecturer, Leeds University. This shows that they had been in touch since the 50s, when Olof was already 61 and Quentin was only 30 years old. Again, here I thank another volunteer researcher at Palazzo Falson, Ellen Banderman, who has catalogued and transcribed the personal diaries of our archives and kindly brought to my attention information in relation to Quentin Hughes. This photo is from the Courtauld Institute of Art photo collection, and it is the only one I have found so far of the two gentlemen in discussion. Quentin with a Rolex camera hanging across his shoulder, and Olof Gollcher, who was taking him on a cultural tour around Malta and Gozo, highlighting significant architectural buildings and structures. It is interesting to discover a photograph taken by Quentin that is dated also April 1950, which is the middle photo showing a detail of the reconstruction of the facade capital of the Floriana parish church. Incidentally, Olof was a member of the Ancient Monuments in Malta Committee to assess war damages to historic buildings, prehistoric, Phoenician and Roman, early medieval and ecclesiastical. In fact, in an archival document of Antiques Malta, listed in the war damage assessment of ecclesiastical building is the parish church of St. Publius, built in 1771. So probably Olof knew so well the damaged buildings in Malta that he was passing on this information to Quentin. The first letter I'm discussing is dated 30th June 1956, and here Quentin writes that he was pleased to hear that Olof liked his book, probably referring to the building of Malta 1530-1795, which was published in the same year, 1956. Quentin showed interest of possibly publishing a book on Gozo, and he said that he, and I quote, wanted to come to Malta to take better photos of Malta and produce a well-illustrated book with simplified text of Maltese architecture, which will be more useful to the average tourist. In the library of Palazzo Falson, we still have the copy of Quentin Hughes' book, The Building of Malta, so yes, he did return it. And Olof marks the foreword of the book proudly, and here he sort of marks the pages where he is mentioned, and Palazzo Falson at the time was Norman House. So Quentin says that Palazzo Falson was a typical example of early palaces in Mdina and Rabat, and the footnote states that he was indebted to Olof Gollcher for this information. So here are some photos which still exist at the Courtauld Institute, and they were also published in the building of Malta. This is the main gate, and there is the sentry box at the junction of the English and French curtains. The next letter that we have, Quentin writes to Olof announcing that he hoped to visit again in Easter in 1957. And he says that he would like to see Olof's notes on the architecture of Gozo. Now we will come to this later on. Another key letter in the collection at Palazzo Falson is undated. However, it can be placed in the time frame of summer 1958. Here Quentin thanks Olof for his excellent photographs he had sent him and some press cuttings, but he also refers to some drawings by Gollcher, but does not elaborate anymore about that, and we'll come to it. But he did mention something very important, and he said that he had these photos enlarged at the Courtauld Institute of Art. and he claims that there were around 500 photos. This very last sentence took me on a research journey to visit the courtyard and explore their photo archives collection in relation to this letter. Contacts were facilitated, by Vanessa Bahajar, who is volunteer at the courtyard while studying in the UK. On this research trip, I was accompanied and helped by other volunteers and friends from the Notarial Archives, Malta. So this is an example how the photos are kept. They're just mounted on a carton paper, just stuck on the front side, and there is just a very brief description, and at the back there are either rubber stamped or else written as Quentin Hughes. Among the collection, I found pictures of Palazzo Falson, at the time listed as Norman House, with the facade detail. And here you can obviously recognize the mullion windows and the serrated frieze of Palazzo Falson. In another letter, Quentin thanks Mrs. Gollcher for her kind hospitality and for a most enjoyable lunch that they had in Mdina. He had asked also to thank Olof on his behalf for his help both in Malta and Gozo. So this letter proves once again that Quentin was in Malta in 1958 and that they had become very good friends. Another letter mentions again these notebooks, which made me really curious to see where these notebooks are. And in fact, we did find them in the archives. So the reference to the notebooks in the letters led to finding the exact entry note, which says Gozo, 10th April 1958 with Quentin Hughes, and followed by a list of places that they visited together, including 3 beehives. Now, at the courtyard, I managed to find a photo. I'm not sure whether they were referring to this beehive in particular, in Kerchem, Gozo. And that is the picture by Quentin. Actually, this is one of the notebooks that Olof was keeping about Gozo and historic places that were of interest to him. He could either have had these notes before, since he sent them to Quentin, or else he was listing all these places, and then later on he lent these books to Quentin to notify the photos that they had taken together. So there was a very strong connection between the two. In a separate entry in the diary of Olof, it gives us some information about their whereabouts in Gozo. First, he says that they had lunch at Villa Brunswick in Mjar. He mentions it as my home in the countryside. And then that they took the 2 p.m. Gozo boat and stayed at the Grand Hotel in Mjar. And the following day, they kept on working and going around Gozo, but they also had lunch at the Duke of Edinburgh Hotel and supper at the Grand Hotel in Mjar. And in his own words, the good day carried on. This is an example of one of the pages in the notebooks. And here you can see some drawings and sketches that Oli, as we like to call him, of Gozo. And here I am comparing one of the designs to a fountain that is in Gozo, Ain Gbira, and again we have proof that they were, sort of following the same trail of all these notes in the notebook. They were also interested in other features, architectural features. In this case, we have a collection of house balconies at St. Lawrence in Gozo, and the decorative stonework of another balcony in Church Street, Arp, Gozo. Photo of Fort Chambray, and here Olof in his notebooks would also add in some information, like it was built in 1749 by Bailiff Jacob Francis de Chambray, a Norman knight, and he keeps on more information about knights involved in these historic buildings. Here you can see the parish church of St. George in Gozo, and again we find a note, the only parish church on the island, he says, was St. George in 1678. All these photos come from the Courtauld Institute, and these sketches are from the notebooks. Another sweet sketch is of a Wrightson overlooking Bingemma Gozo, and he was taking note of the keystones as well. And another drawing of Gigantia temples. So I tried to compare the drawings, the notes, the letters, and the photos of Quentin. Now, they weren't only taking photos of Gozo. I just put in two photos, one of Valletta, which shows the gabled roof of the great hospital of the order, which is Dar el-Mediterranean, and another set of photos of Lia, Villa Gurjon, the tower, and the detailed balcony. In his last letter of our archives, Quentin shows that he was still in touch with Olof till his late years. And on his request, on Ollie's request, he had promised to send two of his students, Jeremy and Nigel, to take part in the underwater exhibition in Sicily. And here we have a very sweet photo of Olof Gollcher accompanying in one of the underwater archaeology exhibitions in Gozo. And here again, I must thank another researcher, volunteer, Professor George Camilleri, who has done an extensive study on this subject. And this is a drawing of Schlendi Tower by Ollie. I must thank the whole group who helped me, the Notarial Archives group. It was fun working together. Vanessa Bahajar, Dr. Jonah Bella, Dr. Teresa Zammitlupi, Chanel Briffa, Maria Borch, Isabel Camilleri, and Tom Bilson, the head of the digital media, the Courtauld, who gave us full access to the collection. I also thank Palazzo Falson volunteers, which I have mentioned, and the dedicated staff of the museum. I also thank my family. Thank you very much. I would like now to invite Dr. Roger Vella Bonavita.
This is only the second lecture that I've given in my life from a text. The first was when I joined the University of Malta, and it was a disaster. The second one is this one, which I hope will be less of one. The advantage of ad-libbing is you can look at your audience, certainly when you can see, and you can see whether you're engaging their attention, tell a dirty joke or something. But when you're reading, you don't have this luxury. So I have to read. Professor James Quentin Hughes, OBE, and Bar, is the doyen of Malta's architectural history, an outstanding professor of architecture at her university, an artist and pioneer of research on Malta's gunpowder fortifications. He deservedly received Malta's highest honour, Algia Republica. This symposium focuses on Quentin's work in Malta and on his artistic output. But it is clear from conversations with his friends, by just looking at his 6-page bibliography, one-liners, and reading through his obituaries in the British national press, that his achievements in England, where he spent most of his working life, were, if anything, even more impressive and therefore deserve notice here. This is what I want to talk about. He was born in 1920. He joined the architecture course at Liverpool University in 1939, and he was commissioned into Royal Artillery in 1941. He was posted to Malta in 1942 at the height of the siege. Waiting for the invasion that thankfully never came was, he told me, the most boring and frustrating time of his life. Nevertheless, during his free time here, Quentin visited and sketched many of Malta's architectural gems. In time, he put this research on Malta to good use. In 1943, Quentin was transferred to the Special Air Service, the SAS. And on one night in January 1944, shortly before the Anzio landings, Lieutenant James, who was also known as Jimmy in the army, Jimmy Hughes, and a party of 5 SAS paratroops under Major Anthony Widrington flew from an airbase in southern Italy to carry out Operation Pomegranate. Their mission was to destroy the planes of a German reconnaissance squadron at an airfield near Assisi. The commando team parachuted near Lake Trasimene, and seconds later their plane flew into a mountain. They were miles from their target and so had to trek across mountainous and rugged country to reach their target area. As the group crossed a fast-flowing river, a German sentry raised the alarm and the SAS party scattered. Quentin and Widrington went up again, but they lost touch with their men, and these took no further part in the operation. The two officers pressed on, dodging enemy patrols with great difficulty. Eventually, they collapsed exhausted into a convenient hedge, where, Quentin told me, they hid while the Germans scoured the country around them, sometimes passing only feet away. When he awoke in the morning, Quentin woke in the morning, the first thing he saw as he peered through the foliage was a Luftwaffe flag. They had spent a comfortable night in the perimeter hedge of the very airfield they were sent to attack, and the Germans had failed to search their own airfield during the preceding night. Very lucky. As they approached the enemy planes that evening, the airfield's landing lights came on and 4 Junkers flew in. A 5th crashed on landing. The ensuing commotion forced the 2 officers to lie low until well after 10 p.m. And then they planted demolition charges on the enemy aircraft. The officers were defusing the remaining charges after the German planes had been destroyed when one exploded, the charges, killing Widrington, and Quentin lost an eye. He burnt his maps, fired his pistol in the air to attract attention. He was taken to hospital in Perugia, interrogated, put into solitary confinements. Shortly afterwards, friendly Luftwaffe medical staff told him that once fit enough, the SD, this is the intelligence arm of the German SS, would execute him in accordance with Hitler's infamous commando order, which stipulated that Allied soldiers caught behind the lines would be shot even if captured in uniform. Though a German officer drove to Field Marshal Kesselring's headquarters to save Quentin's life by registering him as a prisoner of war, the SS took charge of him nonetheless and dispatched him by train to Germany for execution. He escaped from the moving train near Modena together with 2 other prisoners and headed for the Allied lines some 300 miles to the south. At the end of March, assisted by local partisans, they joined 22 escapees, making for the Adriatic coast. And on the 9th May, all embarked from Torre di Palme on a clinker-built fishing boat which had not been afloat for 2 years. Soon they were up to their waists in water and only kept the boat afloat by bailing frantically with their cloth caps. The hull's planks gradually swelled and closed the leaks. They lost the vessel's mast and sail, but the wind and current helped them drift about 75 miles southwards, and they returned to Allied territory the next day. Besides reporting on Operation Pomegranate, Quentin brought to the Allies the first concrete information about Hitler's infamous commando order, referred to just before. For his part in Operation Pomegranate, Quentin earned the Military Cross. The citation recorded that he and Widrington had destroyed 4 Ju-88s, 2 Pfizer Storch aircraft, and 1 Ju-52. A fortnight later, he was awarded a 2nd Military Cross for his escape. He returned to Britain, was promoted to Major, and became commander of the SAS HQ squadron, and a jeep accident forced him to retire. He never forgot his SAS training. In his mid-60s, while visiting a Second World War gun position on England's south coast, with a party from the Fortress Study Group, which he had formed, Quentin slipped on a wet parapet and fell a full 10 feet onto the concrete pad below. He performed a perfect paratrooper's landing, rolling over to rise to his feet quite unharmed, and his expensive camera was undamaged as well. There was loud applause and demands for an encore, which he declined. Once more a civilian, Quentin took a shortened ex-serviceman's degree course in architecture and a diploma in civic design at Liverpool University. Then he joined Leeds College of Art as a lecturer, 1947 to 55, and took his doctorate in modern history at Leeds University on the thesis on the architecture of, wait for it, Baroque Malta. He returned to Liverpool's University School of Architecture in 1955 to teach and to lecture on conservation, and his first book, The Building of Malta, appeared in 1956. One of his students in Liverpool in the 1960s was John Harris, who sadly cannot be here today. He did, however, send an appreciation of Quentin. And here is part of it, slightly edited. It speaks volumes for the regard Quentin was held in by his students. I first met Quentin, he writes, at my interview for a place at Liverpool University. I remember he was tolerant of the naive and cocky provincial grammar boy that I was, and we agreed that the prefaces to George Bernard Shaw's plays were much better than the plays themselves. This is an interview to do architecture. I went on to study in Liverpool in September 1962. The Beatles were hardly known outside Liverpool. I travelled there in trains pulled by steam engines. Most of the films were black and white. Over the next 5 years, everything would change in Britain, and especially for me. And it always seemed to me that Quentin was part of that change. The air of authority, the dynamism, the Bristol Gran Turismo car, the single frosted spectacle lens, especially that. The practical look, it seemed, it gave him. And that were always two secretaries who seemed to be working for him alone. All this was very memorable. Charisma is the word we would use these days, all very different from what I was used to at school. So much of the swinging 60s centred on Liverpool, a city Quentin dearly loved and often wrote about. He enthused us all who were not Scousers. Scousers are Liverpudlians in Scouse, to love the city. Probably some of us were surprised to see the measured drawings and research we were required to do for him in Liverpool appear later uncredited in his books on the city. We forgave him. It was a useful lesson about real life and a source of some pride. And yet there was always a way in which Quentin's love of Liverpool was very much pre-Beatles. I'm not sure he's much affected by this or even noticed the swinging 60s. As part of this feeling for the continuing past of the city, Quentin was vehemently opposed to the proposal to clean up St George's Hall, now a World Heritage Monument, which was soot black and streaked white by rainwater runoff in the most wonderful way. Not only beautiful in itself, but a record of Liverpool's industrial, gritty past. Though he lost that battle, the hall was dirty again fairly quickly. I like the idea of remembering Quentin as an usher into a new age while representing the best of the recent past. The 50s were not to be despised just because the 60s seemed to change everything. That wonderful book Seaport also introduced me to the possibilities of photography. Dave Wrightson took the photographs, but to me the overall production seemed Quentin's. This soot and whitewash style of photography was very much of the time, but its unsentimental objectivity eminently suited Liverpool's buildings. Many contemporaries were inspired to be photographers by Bailey's photographs of Jean Shrimpington's legs. She was the world's first supermodel. But I, says my friend, was inspired by Wrightson's photographs of the Albert Dock. Quentin's Renaissance architecture co-authored with Norbert Ninton remains an invaluable work. Being encouraged to buy books written by our lecturers was another surprise to the more active of us, naive of us. But even at 60 shillings, that's £3, this was well worth it. I believe it remains the best, most accessible introduction to the period, not least because of its immaculate drawings. I still have it and consult it frequently. That book and Quentin's lectures weaned me from my schoolboy, Betjeman-like exclusive interest in medieval churches. I fired an interest in Renaissance and Baroque culture in all its forms that has never left me, and I am grateful. Schools of architecture within universities, as opposed to those in polytechnics, were odd places in those days, committed to academic study partly to conform with the established image of a university, but mainly to produce competent and hopefully inspired designers. Hence so much architectural history in the curriculum. Quentin felt, I'm sure, that an architect should not just be a technician or instinctive artist, but rather a cultured person, well versed in the background of his profession and able to hold his own in intellectual society. For him, history was not just an add-on to please the university senate. It was important to produce a rounded person. Quentin made the study of architectural history a living thing, not practiced in an ivory tower or in some other lectures seem to do. Hence his use of Liverpool as a teaching resource. But I have to say, continues, that the subject of fortifications never arose in the period 1962 to 71. The other speakers on this symposium will speak about Quentin's contributions to architecture in Malta and his work as an artist. It's appropriate, however, to stress the respect he earned for his work in Britain. The late eminent architect Dennis Sharp of Manchester University wrote Quentin's eulogy in The Independent, that's the London Independent. It summarises his work on British architecture, conversation and scholarship before and after his Malta period. In part, Sharp writes, Liverpool owes much to Quentin Hughes and its indefatigable promoter. Born in the city in 1920, he studied there from 39 to 47, taught in many capacities in the architecture schools of 1955, and wrote widely about it in numerous books and articles. He achieved the enviable status of a kind of Liverpool master of works. He helped tremendously, if not actually enabled, the city to be crowned Europe's City of Culture for 2008. Quentin underlined the importance of Liverpool in his book Seaport, Architecture and Townscape in Liverpool in 1964. He stressed its architectural significance and importance as the finest British Victorian and Edwardian city. This was despite decades of neglect and a genuine loss of purpose. In 1967, he suggested in a national newspaper that Liverpool's future would lie in cultural tourism. The same year, he produced a detailed policy for the conservation of the city's architecture, and it became the Liverpool City Council's official policy. What he did in establishing the modern reputation and the architectural inventory of Liverpool, he attempted to repeat, or rather precurse, by in his second home, his beloved islands of Malta and Gozo. It is to Liverpool one must turn to witness the legacy of the single-minded local but truly European historian, teacher and architect. Indeed, much of the centre of Liverpool remains today largely because of his enthusiastic and knowledgeable interest in important existing buildings. In his concern he set a very high standard in judging the appropriateness of development and the context of new structures. These are terms we on our lips all the time today. He advised on the Merseyside Structural Plan. He chaired the Merseyside Civic Society, founded Liverpool Heritage Bureau, and acted as buildings consultant to Shankland Cox and Liverpool Civic Council. His activities helped preserve the Albert Dock warehouses of 1839 to 45 and other buildings like that. In addition to all his other activities, he also found time to practice as an architect. He designed houses in Surrey, renovated the Lady Lever Art Gallery in Port Sunlight. He received the Civic Trust commendation for the work he did on Greenbank House, Liverpool, converting it into a university club in 1964. He was responsible for the Civic Trust improvement schemes for Bridge Street and Eastgate in Chester, and the conversion of a chapel to house the Chester Repertory Theatre in 1965. For generations of students at the Liverpool School of Architecture, he was the one member of staff who always found time to listen and advise on design issues, historical studies and graduate supervision. The range of work he supervised was astonishing, from my own thesis on modern architecture and expressionism, 1961 to 63, a subject which he confessed he knew nothing at all about, to an M.Phil thesis on Lutyens' work on Liverpool Cathedral, for which he had full reservoirs of knowledge. Hughes was the founding member and leading light in the formation of the Fortress Study Group, which was established in Oxford some 25 years ago. This is back in 2008, of course, that this is written. After many years, he was the editor. For many years, he was the editor of the FSG Journal. He was elected a member of the International Bergen Institute in Germany and was held in high regard for his knowledge of military architecture. More personally, he introduced me to the study of Francesco Laparelli's work in Valletta, and he encouraged me to prepare a critical edition and translation of his extant papers. This led to a long and difficult task to earn my doctorate, but sadly he died before I presented my thesis. He was also a very good friend and generous one. It was a privilege and a pleasure to contribute to his memory. But I will end with a story of how I met him. He wrote, I wasn't interested in fortifications, so I was a 19th century historian. And I read his book, Fortress, when it came out. And I said to myself, how can he do this? He hasn't mentioned the 100-ton gun. So I went across to the architecture department, and he was very, very busy, and as clear I was a nuisance. He was trying to do things that this chap I'd never met was asking for his attention. And eventually he said, yes, what I do? I said, I've read your book. Oh, good. He said, I said, you haven't mentioned the gun. What gun? He said. I said, the 100-ton gun. What 100-ton gun? The one here in Malta. The actual gun? Yeah. You mean the 100-ton gun is in Malta? Yes. And the penny dropped. He said, where is it? I said, Rinella. Where's that? To the right of Ricastle. What are you doing this afternoon? And that became the start of a very, very long friendship. We visited all the British forts. We cried when we saw what was happening to them in terms of vandalism. So I owe him a lot. It's worth coming from Australia to pay him tribute. Thank you.
I'm afraid this is not me speaking. A message from Richard England. Quentin Hughes' association with Malta was twofold. Initially as a soldier, and later in the capacity of pedagogue and architectural historian. During the Second World War, he served on the island, and later in the mid-60s in connection with the Royal University of Malta, as it then was, where he was involved in the setting up of a new department of architecture. On the invitation of the then Vice-Chancellor, the intention was to create an architectural department of international stature which would function as a hub for the whole of the Mediterranean. For the first time, Maltese students would have had the opportunity to listen to talks and lectures by eminent, established international personalities. The course promised much, but regretfully, all too soon, with the political changes in the early 70s, the project was soon stifled and suffocated, and the architectural course returned to its former unimaginative, mundane curriculum. Quentin Hughes was a wonderful, inimitable scholar, a generous teacher, architectural historian, and former wartime soldier. Posted in Malta in 1941, he befriended my father, that's Richard England's father, and often visited the family's Melliha rock-hewn shelter. I recall a now lost photograph of myself aged 5, sitting on Quentin's lap, on the shelter's garden dry stone walls. An intriguing prophetic déjà vu, the precursor of the future close relationship that we were to share later. Towards the end of his days, I was able to acquire his goldmine album of wartime Malta drawings, already documenting his early penchant for the unique architectural typology of our island, which he appropriately described as a different place, a place which must be known to be understood, and understood to be enjoyed. Not very long, just a tiny bit more. His scholarly publications on the history of Maltese architecture. He is not only a remarkable pedagogue of myself and many others, but also a person of considerable intellectual and academic stature, overlaid with a childlike enthusiasm and a mischievous twinkle, draped with a witty, wicked sense of humour. His savant qualities as tutor, advisor and mentor remain influences in all the annals of my life. Towards the end of his life, I was particularly happy to have contributed to his being appropriately awarded Malta's highest distinction, that of the Order of Merit, for which he remained particularly grateful. That's from Richard England. Now, if you can bear it, something from me. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel very honoured to be allowed to give my opinion regarding an outstanding performer. And by using the word performer, I am not referring to an actor, but to Quentin Hughes himself, who tackled more than one sphere of activity and always performed with star quality. There are a number of us here today who are indeed more able than I am to ascertain the outstanding talent left us to ponder over and bow our heads to. Quentin Hughes' talents live on to stimulate our education our knowledge, and indeed our interests and researches. For us today, I shall focus for a little on his paintings. Not his architectural drawings, but his capturing of perhaps passing visual realities. I would particularly like to look at the war years. I have seen 18 of his watercolors and drawings connected with Malta, 4 pictures, 2 very strong charcoal drawings, and 2 watercolors show war action. 2 drawings and 1 watercolor deal with weapons, and in this case the 3 pictures each depict a well-detailed cannon on wheels. 9 are scenes of particular architectural interest. 1 is a drawing of a Maltese fishing boat, and there's precious watercolor self-portrait of Quentin during the war. All the terms, all the items I have mentioned are indeed national patrimony, and I am sure they form part of other people's lectures. There are more to be seen, of course. In the year 2000, his Malta Wartime Pictures was published in an edition of only 50 copies and is now, consequently, a very rare collector's item. His most colourful picture, the bomb at Lucca Aerodrome, shows what looks like a surreal hand at the base of the black smoke, and all 5 fingers set apart and pointing up. The fields all around look tranquil, the church is untouched, and the sea is calm. At first sight, a pretty picture, but with closer examination, one sees drama in the heart of innocence. The listing ship in another picture tells its own tale, while the little deathly bomber heads away through a smouldering background. Quentin Hughes, OBE, MC, PhD, FSA, MOM, deserves all the recognition that he has received to date. The scenes in Malta, which a war artist might record, were mostly horrific. Not all, though. We are aware that a war artist had to have some sort of official status. Otherwise, he or she might have been misconstrued to be a spy. The British nearly always sent out a war artist to record happenings in their wars. London's Imperial War Museum and the National Army Museum abound with moving, significant, and alarming pictures, including Malta scenes. Indeed, our own Malta National War Museum can testify to this. Yes, of course. Quentin Hughes ranks among the war artists in Malta in World War II. Among these worthies was Dennis Alfred Barnum, the landscape painter, war artist, and RAF pilot. Highly important was Leslie Cole, who was in 1943 assigned as the British government's official war artist for Malta. He performed his job with alacrity and imagination. His official designation in Malta was Ministry of Information War Artist. He is known to have presented himself to the Governor of Malta, Field Marshal Lord Gort, VC, wearing 3 pips on his shoulders because he was given the rank of captain for the Malta job. Apparently, Gort expected him to paint charming pictures of the islands without feeling the need to emphasize the dereliction of war. Leslie Cole did not agree, and like our Quentin Hughes, showed some of the horrors. He discreetly faded out the limelight, removed his pips, and mixed freely with the Tommy and the locals. And speaking of Tommies, another artist, Edwin Reed, recorded some good action watercolors while still in his early 20s. 2 important contemporaries visited Malta during the war, but like Quentin Hughes, were not specifically assigned as Malta's war artist by the government. First was Norman Wilkinson, who would later become president of the Royal Society of Marine Painters, and whose pictures of the convoy ship Ohio battling through are well recorded. Secondly, his predecessor as president of the Royal Society of Marine Painters, Charles Pears, also visited Malta. His pictures are as evocative, colourful, and full of action as any I have seen, but alas, they are few and far between, and I have only seen 1 Malta setting. Another prestigious artist worth mentioning is Montague Dawson. He is known to have painted 4 pictures featuring Malta. HMS Aurora enters Valletta. The tanker Ohio gets through. Relief convoys fight the winter gales off Malta, and a cruiser enters the Grand Harbour at Valletta. The whereabouts of these pictures are unknown to me, but I have seen the photographs. The name E.G. Lambert as a war artist in Malta also deserves mention for detail and accuracy. While on the subject of war artists, contemporary with Quentin Hughes, that local artist Joseph Gallia did indeed produce not only very commercial panorama pictures of our principal harbours, but also some, but only a few, detailed and accurate, sad and pitiful bombardment scenes. Alfred Gerarda, another Maltese artist, whose drawings often featured in the press, painted that unforgettable indoor scene of a whole family beneath a table, boxes and mattresses on top, waiting for the worst. More local names: Anton Inglot drew Faldetta ladies, taking shelter among other subjects. I have also seen an excellent oil painting of, once again, the dramatic arrival of the Ohio by Giuseppe Arcidiacono. John Worsley was official war artist in the Commander-in-Chief's Staff Mediterranean of 1942. He was aged 23. He painted Grand Harbour full of ships, was taken prisoner of war in 1943. 60 of his works are now in the Imperial War Museum. Worsley became a member of the Royal Society of Being Artists and exhibited at the Royal Academy and the famous Mall Galleries in London's West End. I have only traced 2 wartime pictures by our supreme for his period local artist Edward Caruana Dingley. No, he was not a war artist, but his picture of the dismal, wretched and pitiable atmosphere in a wartime shelter is truly second to none. There is one more Maltese artist in the context of war whom I need to mention. He painted pictures of both action and devastation, and I consider him to be grossly underestimated. He was 22 in 1942 and studying to become a lawyer. He died 20 years ago. His name was Francis Xavier Vassallo, and when I met him one day in 1990, I was gently critical of some of his work, saying, "Why do you paint pictures of time past? Have you ever painted anything you actually saw with your own eyes?" He answered, "I painted war pictures, but not to sell," virtually saying, "Who would want them?" When I eventually saw them for myself, I was more than a little impressed. I was amazed. We must remember that people caught sketching could be suspected and even accused and arrested of being spies in those bleak days of bombardment. What he produced is important and indeed should be better known and preserved, and indeed shared. To conclude, I feel we might consider assembling a Malta wartime art exhibition, or even just have a book of war artists for Malta. Of course, Quentin Hughes must feature, as he certainly should.
Good morning. I'm speaking here today just because I was very fortunate to be a member of a group of 20-odd students who studied at the Royal University of Malta in the course of architecture between 1968 and 1973, some 50 years ago, under the professorship of James Quentin Hughes. Whatever I'm going to say today is based on my own personal opinions and impressions of Quentin and the time when he was here. I'll just remind you, Quentin, as was said before, was, as Marquis de Piro said, was a war hero, but he was also one of the very first members of the SAS, the Special Air Service, the crack British regiment. He was very respected in Liverpool, his place of birth, and where he lived. for his work in promoting the revitalization of the city. This is a picture of the Albert Dock taken probably just after the war. It was in more or less the same condition in the 1970s when I was there. Quentin was not the architect for its revitalization. That is part of it today. But he promoted it. He was one of the persons who worked very hard to promote it. And I remember him coming into the university and trying to convince lecturers to back his efforts to promote this, and also Victorian and Edwardian architecture in Liverpool, which nobody even considered as being worthy of preservation at the time. And his books, as was said before, the Building of Malta on the right-hand side, published in 1956 at a time when no Maltese architect or historian had even bothered to document the buildings of the knights, the important buildings of the knights. It had to be Quentin to do this. This shows his love for Malta, which started at a very early age. Quentin, one of Quentin's favorite quotes was, "A good architect is one who can give his client what his client never thought he could get." Quentin was brought to Malta by Professor Edwin Borch Costanzi to introduce some quality into the course of architecture. One must not forget that the late 60s constituted a period which was then known as the boom period, when construction activity was reaching levels which were never heard of before, obviously nothing like what's happening today, and during which architects were more interested in practicing the lucrative profession than in teaching it. This is a Christmas card which I produced in about 1972, by which time the boom was over. This represents Father Christmas bringing a boom back in the form of a present. So, in October 1968, a group of students, I'm sorry about the quality of the picture, but it's the best I could find, all male, who came from very, very different backgrounds, but who had all obtained first-rate qualifications, which were required for entry into the course, met in what was then the Arts Lecture Theatre at Talrop. I must tell you that throughout Quentin's term in Malta, there was never a dedicated building for architecture, for architects. This is a sketch which I produced in about 1972, it's the original, which was used as part of the university prospectus. And it shows what was built at the time. When we were there. Quentin's office and the administration for the department were located in 2 or 3 rooms underneath the rector's office. Our studio was the Arts Lecture Theatre, and our lecture room was a basement with very low ceiling and very bad light and ventilation underneath the sciences block on the right-hand side of the picture. Quentin very quickly took control, however. He set off by rebranding the course. It was no longer the Department of Architecture, it became RUMDA, R-U-M-D-A, an acronym for Royal University of Malta Department of Architecture. He redecorated the offices and our lecture theatre using modern contemporary furniture, and his masterstroke was handpicking a young, intelligent and attractive female secretary who must have put the other professors' backs up. She's here somewhere. Because most secretaries at the time tended to be old and grumpy. So the quality started to show straight away. Quentin laid out for us in the lecture theatre where we met, in the arts lecture theatre where we met, a considerable number of very beautiful architectural and historical books. which we obviously browsed through until he arrived. What a wonderful way to introduce students to the lovely world of architecture. When he arrived, he spoke to us about how the course would be structured. I was struck by his continuous underlying message, which was mentioned again in Richard England's speech, I think, which was that he wanted to expose us primarily to culture rather than to building. You are not here to become periti. You are here to obtain an education in the arts and sciences related to architecture. Whether or not you later decide to become a perit will be up to you. That was his mission, I believe. And I do wish that this philosophy would be practiced more in our university, not so much in the architecture department, but in other faculties. In the end, each and every one of his students had successful careers. Some of them are here, in various fields, not just architecture. Quentin was right. Quentin devised a 2-degree course. The first 3 years would lead to a BA degree, and only students who showed propensity to become good architects would be allowed to continue for another 2 years to achieve a BArch degree. The practice of architecture was too precious to allow persons who are not the best to qualify to exercise it. The 2-tier course was ridiculed by some at the time, by many at the time. However, I see that after 50 years, the University of Malta has gone back to the 2-tier system. Quentin was right again. Quentin predicted that the time when a perit was a jack of 2 trades, architectural design and structural design, and a master of none, was to end, in favor of separate degree courses for the 2 professions. Again, the system is now in place at our university, 50 years after, and it is astonishing, in my opinion, to see that even the practice of architecture on its own is now further broken down to specialized areas, as demanded by the current industry requirements. Quentin was right. Quentin believed in the concept of team building at a time when this term had not even been invented. In our first year, he arranged for the entire group to spend a week in Gozo, staying in the same hotel, observing and recording Gozo villages in groups rather than as individuals. Every day we would explore together, work together, and drink together. And the experience built up a strong fraternal relationship between us. I'm wearing this rather colorful tie. This is 1969 vintage. It was bought at the time in Gozo. Most of the students had one, and Quentin had a few, which I remember him wearing very proudly in Liverpool. We are still, all the 1968 students are still the best of friends, and we meet regularly, socially, and we have always helped each other in our professional activities. I have to repeat, Quentin was right. In line with Quentin's objective of exposing us to cultural values, he encouraged us to travel abroad and absorb both historical and contemporary art and architecture. But he also makes sure that he invited every artist and architect on the island who mattered to meet us, either formally or informally. Personalities such as Desmond Morris, Basil Spence, best known for his Coventry Cathedral or a house in Fawara, Richard de Marco, Scottish artist who made some very beautiful pen and ink drawings of Maltese townscape, Nicholas Montserrat, Gabriel Caruana, of course, who at the time was still making plates. He was making very colorful plates. And Victor Passmore. They all crossed our paths at some time or other, thanks to Quentin. And then there was also a young architect called Richard England, who was doing some interesting things at the time. Malta appears to have attracted many intellectuals and sages in the 70s, who came here by their own volition. in stark difference to the situation today, where the few who come have to be paid to do so. The course content itself was rich, and our lecturers, apart from Quentin and one or two others who were here permanently, would visit for a few weeks at a time, mostly from the University of Liverpool, which at the time was one of the best schools in the UK, probably still is, and gave courses about various subjects, some of them quite novel to Malta, such as acoustics, lighting design, and urban design. These were all brilliant men in their individual fields. Only the best were good enough for Quentin's students. I recall artist Arthur Ballard, a very famous Liverpool artist, Gerald Beach, a prominent architect who has listed buildings in the UK, acoustics expert Carl Pinfold, top structural engineer Bill Curtin, who ran the best structural office in Liverpool, and I believe now curtains, he's no longer alive, but curtains are spread all over the UK. And urban designer Mickey King. This is a photograph taken at Mickey's 70th birthday. The chap in the center is Vince Buttigieg, again one of the students in our course who is living in the UK and is not practicing architecture but doing something totally different. And there was also historian Dennis Sharp. The logistics of snatching these persons away from their academic or professional activities in the UK in order to come to teach in Malta could not have been easy, and reflects the respect which Quentin enjoyed at the time. There were also important Maltese lecturers, like Peter Saracino-Glott, Andres Amit, and Dr. Albert Ganado. And then there were certain peripheral activities which Quentin offered to his students in order to further promote his dream of spawning a group of erudite men from this mob. He set up a tape recorder in his room, in his private office, one of those old machines with big 4-inch reels, on which he recorded bits of classical music, and he would invite us to sit in there during our lunch breaks and listen to this music and appreciate this music while he was doing other things. Quentin's room was always open. As students, we would occasionally look through the files on his bookshelves, especially when the secretary was not there, in order to discover his comments about us and marks for our projects. I'm sure that Quentin knew this. I'm sure that he knew that we knew that he knew this. And I'm sure that he hoped we would do this. He had no secrets from us. He also coached us in the art of public speaking. It didn't work very well with me, but he asked each one of us to prepare a talk once a week on any subject that we wished, varying from Picasso to bird shooting, and to deliver the talk to the students and the staff in the basement room. These were truly exciting times, which were to come to a brutal end sometime in our fifth year at the university. This is a photograph taken in 1972, as you can see, and you can see the way we developed from the original group. Now I think, you can see that we're smarter, looking after our appearance a bit more. It shows, and it's all Quentin's influence. As I was saying, his times came to a brutal end sometime during our fifth year. It appears that the top man in Malta at the time, a certain Dom Mintoff, who was also a Perit, demanded that Quentin should go back to the old course system, that of producing general practitioners. This position, funnily enough, was supported by the Chamber of Architects, I believe. How things have changed now. The Chamber now is, I think, the top promoter of good architecture in Malta, and has been for some years. But at the time it was different. The Chamber may have had ulterior motives at the time. The boom years were now over. Work for architects had diminished, and I suspect the Chamber did not want British lecturers, Baranin, no matter how brilliant, to take up lecturing posts which could be occupied by Maltese Periti. Quentin would have nothing of this, and he resigned, or was made to resign, I'm not sure. Immediately after my year out practicing in an architect's office, I received a letter from Quentin inviting me to take up a job at the Liverpool University Projects Office, a small architect's office within the School of Architecture, Liverpool, which mainly designed school buildings in the northwest of England. The situation in Malta at the time was not very exciting. Public works architects were out on strike. Future for good architecture appeared to be bleak, and therefore I packed my bags and left. I spent 5 years in that office, guided by my mentor Peter Richardson, who is on the right here, together with Quentin, a brilliant architect who was Quentin's right-hand man during his time in Malta. We designed good primary buildings during this time, schools designed very consciously to reflect a scale appropriate to primary school age kids. I'm always surprised, well, I'm sometimes surprised by the scale of some of the primary schools being built at the moment in Malta, which seem to be built to the scale of giants rather than children. But anyway, throughout this time, as well as throughout my later period of work in Malta, I found myself practicing one quality which Quentin taught me and my peers during our student years, and that was that our buildings should respect the context in which they were to be built. And the arrogance of many architects, both locally and abroad, who declared that the buildings should be iconic, makes me sick. I cringe at the thought of a town or island being covered in iconic buildings, all competing for the super iconic prize. I am proud to say that my buildings, both in the UK and in Malta, are so good that you do not notice them. Quentin was not directly involved in the Liverpool office. However, we clearly met every day, either when he would call into the office for a coffee or very often at the pub on our way home. This is the famous Philharmonic pub in Liverpool, which was one of Quentin's favourites, designed by students of architecture in about 1900. The friendship continued after I left Liverpool and finally came back to Malta in 1985. Phone calls were frequent, and sometimes when Quentin visited Malta, he would look forward to me taking him out on my boat for him to observe and photograph the island from the sea, particularly the remnants of the wartime coastal defence structures. And this brings out another of Quentin's qualities, his loyalty to his friends, even those 30 years his junior. This ends the story of my relationship with the professor, although there is so much more to relate. There's a lot to relate. The various obituaries which appeared in the British newspapers after his death described him as an architect, an academic, a war hero, a man of action, a genial, irreverent, and generous man. I can confirm that all these appellations are accurate. Thank you.
Good morning. I was asked to give this talk today by my good friend David Wrightson, who is a photographer based in Liverpool and who spent 2 lovely weeks with Quint in Malta in 1964, as per his words. Unfortunately, he could not be here today for personal reasons. Unfortunately, my paths in life never crossed with Professor Hughes, but through his books and through the frequent anecdotes which I get recounted to be by my close collaborators, Professor Richard England and Professor Conrad Thake, he's been quite an inspiration on my black and white photography work, and you can feel that he was a larger-than-life personality, and you can actually feel him through what he published and what he achieved. So basically, I will be reading David Wrightson's record of his 2 weeks in Malta with Quint. In the preface to the new 2001 edition of Fortress, Quentin relates that while writing the original book in 1968, he had taken me to Malta with him, whereas in fact he had arranged for me to fly from Rome to Malta at a point in my 1964 to 1965 academic year at the Accademia Britannica. I remember that he met me at the airport, and we were taken to our hotel in Valletta in a chauffeur-driven car, a stylish 1959 Opel Capitan provided by the Maltese Government Tourist Board. We started to plan the project straight away, which was of course to record the historic fabric and townscape of the major towns of Malta and Gozo. Together we went through his list of subjects and locations, referring to a sun chart and a set of maps, a process I can tell personally has not changed in the last 55 years. From these, I was able to determine the time of day likely to result in the most satisfactory black and white image. Once those details were settled, we set out on our itinerary, keeping as far as possible ahead of the sun on its clockwise journey, which I must say was not always entirely successful. Return visits were occasionally necessary. Lunch was taken whenever and wherever it could be made to fit into the day's schedule, and as I recall, we always ate well, seldom forgoing the pleasures of the local wines. The strength of the wines of Gozo led in one instance to the curtailment of the whole program for that day. As a Goddard myself, I can corroborate that fact. Except for the one or two occasions on which we had gone out to photograph aspects of the city at night, our evenings were spent discussing over dinner the plan of action for the next day. On returning in the late afternoon, I retired to my bedroom to develop the films taken during that day, mixing the chemicals in wine bottles provided by the hotel. While the resulting negatives were hanging up to dry, I inspected them for quality and content and reported back during the meal on the need, if any, to revisit a location due to any technical shortcomings. These were thankfully few. Did all go well otherwise? Not exactly. As well as the previously aforementioned wine-related hiatus, progress was slowed down when the Opel's engine overheated and had to be allowed time to cool down. There was one potential disaster after the first week. I had put down my camera, a Mamiya Flex 6x6 twins lens reflex with interchangeable lenses, in order to change lenses. I looked away for a second and on turning round found that it had disappeared. Some things never changed apparently. The deed was very swiftly and very silently done. Enquiries made locally to get the camera returned proved fruitless. Numerous telephone calls revealed that such an article was not to be had for sale or hire in any camera shop on Malta or Gozo. There was nothing to do but carry on. Quent suggested that I use his 35mm camera for a few days until the arrival by air of another high-quality camera, a 6x6 wide-angle Rolleiflex twins lens reflex. This was very generously provided by my late brother, who at my urgent request had packed it up, driven from his home in Chester to Liverpool Airport, and put it on the next flight to Malta. This was a selfless act for which I will always be grateful. Apart from work, what did we talk about over dinner with Quent? I must say, in the intervening 55 years, most of the detail has dropped out of my brain. Coming from a family of uncommunicative males, I was not yet well versed in the art of relaxed conversations with older people. Quentin, 20 years older than me, would have had to do most of the talking. However, I do recall quite clearly remarking that members of my own generation, even some of those with pacifist tendencies, tended to envy him his wartime experiences, which were legend amongst my fellow students. With typical self-depreciation, he played all this down. I also asked him about the loss of his eye at the time of his SAS resistance work in Italy, but again he passed this off, saying that it was due to a motorcycle accident suffered when stationed at an earlier period in Malta. Was this self-depreciation or mischief? I suppose I will never know the truth. The obituary writers, mostly former students, have set forth the many qualities of James Quentin Hughes, a war hero, an aesthete, an architect, an academic, a man of letters, and a man of action, who always offered inspiration and sound advice to his flock. Generous with praise, he tempered this with a modicum of reality, as for instance, when on delivering to him a panoramic print destined for his book Seaport about Liverpool, he exclaimed, "Wrightson, you're a bloody genius," but quickly adding, "photographically, I mean." Always affectionately known as Quent by his students at Liverpool School of Architecture during his lifetime, he is remembered fondly by those of us who have survived the rigors of the life in architecture that he encouraged us to undertake. So this is a small selection of David Wrightson's image from his book Fortress, and I am pleased to announce that David Wrightson has agreed that these negatives will be returned to Malta, his whole collection of 500 negatives, and these will be provided and freely available to academics for research and academic purposes.
Good morning. This is a very personal account of a young budding publisher and an already venerated professor, rather than a very technical or a studied speech of Quentin and his works. I always loved history. My father made sure of that. Together, we read texts by Trump, Ugolini, Brest, Denaro, Vella, and obviously Hughes. For all I knew, at that young age, all these authors were no more. So you can imagine my wonderment when one day a very young Conrad Thake came to the office to propose to us a book jointly written by Quentin Hughes. Coincidentally, my father had met Conrad as an architect at a time when he and Quentin were looking for a publisher for their next book. After a preliminary meeting with Conrad, Quentin made the trip to Malta, sometime in the year 2000. The experience that followed was so unpredictably pleasant. Quentin became a regular visitor to our office. Discussions with Quentin were always delightful. He was always the youngest in the room, interesting, witty, and above all, a great storyteller, especially when he recounted his experiences and anecdotes. Meetings with him were even longer when my father was present. Work on the book, which was eventually published as Malta, the Baroque Island, the gazetteer on the buildings of the Knights in Malta, started in 2001. Daniel Cira, the photographer commissioned for this book, had an arduous task of photographing palaces, auberges, fortifications, churches, and everything else the order had built and was still standing. Quentin knew what he wanted, and we tried to accommodate his requests. Nevertheless, notwithstanding his stature on the subject, he was never patronizing. He was always apprehensive on the cost and feasibility of the project, and appreciative of the work we are doing. Indeed, very rare attributes in a relationship between author and publisher. The months of production progressed smoothly, even longer than we all had anticipated. By the end of 2002, after yet another missed deadline, all for a good cause, mind you, it became evident that we were close to having the production of the book ready. We started making the necessary preparations for its printing, and considering the entity and importance of the title, we had opted to print the book in Italy to assure the best possible quality. In early 2003, given that everything seemed to be almost in order, it was decided to go for a spring launch for the book. The date was fixed for Friday, 9th May at 7:30 p.m. Permission was sought to organize the event at the Church of St. James in Valletta. At the time, this was a great feat, given that the edifice is a place of worship and our event was a profane one. The office of the President was contacted, and the late Guido De Marco had gladly accepted to patronize the proceedings. Professor Richard England and Mariella Pisani-Bencini were also contacted to participate and compare the launch respectively. By March of that year, all seemed in place for a grand launch. Then, during April, production took a bad turn, and there were delays in the finalization and printing of the book. This is the moment when the publisher finds himself between a rock and a hard place. The date is set and the launch was organized, but the book was far from being ready. That's the moment panic starts to creep in. The only comfort was that Quentin was in Liverpool, far enough from sensing my nervousness. A week to the launch, notwithstanding assurances from the printers in Italy, the book was far from being ready. The same comforting distance between the publisher and the author became a nightmare between the publisher and the printer. May was round the corner, and yet no sign of the book. By Monday, 5th May, fever was running high, and Quentin was soon to be in Malta. Postponing the launch was not an option, but on the other hand, having a launch without a book would have been a disaster. I could not and would not face Quentin without the book. Calls between Malta and Italy increased exponentially between Monday and Wednesday. Their tone were between hope and despair. On Wednesday afternoon, 2 days to the launch, I received news that 2 boxes of the book were on their way to be sent by courier. They should arrive in Malta within 24 hours. What a relief. I took so many deep breaths at the news that I could hardly talk, and feeling satisfied to have pulled it off, I relaxed waiting for the tracking number to be sent. The tracking number arrived soon after, and off I went to check if all was true. The boxes were on their way to Milan from Florence. Finally, the books were really going to arrive. From the hub in Milan, they would eventually make their way to Malta, or so I thought. If I remember well, Quentin arrived on Wednesday late afternoon. As expected, he came to the office to see the book. I told him what happened, and in his usual jolly spirit, he took it quite well, and even joked about the thought of having the book lunch without the book. To reassure him and all, I showed them, and I mean them, him and Conrad Thake, the courier's tracking window. By that time, the books had arrived in Milan and were sitting somewhere in a warehouse. I continued to check tracking ever so often, and by late evening, the books, when I say late evening, that was Thursday night, the eve of the launch, the books were still in Milan. I went to bed. After one last peep at the computer, slightly worried but reassured that the courier was a reliable one, which means that the book should arrive in Malta latest Thursday evening. As soon as I woke up on Thursday, I went straight to my computer, and to my relief, the books had left Milan, but to my dismay, they were on their way to Hamburg. I immediately called the printer to check the address where the books were sent. I also tried to call the courier's office in Malta, but it was still too early. I kept on refreshing and checking my computer every minute, trying to make sense of what was happening. Again, dark clouds loomed over me, and this time I was going to get wet, if not soaked. By the time the courier's office opened, the books had arrived in Hamburg. I told the person answering that I am expecting books by the end of the day for a launch the day after, and that my package was nowhere close to Malta, but, as it happens, going even further away. He assured me that that's the way they work, and they route packages through their networks to find the fastest way possible to reach destination. Although incomprehensible to me, I took their word. After all, they knew best how to do their work. Nonetheless, I continued to check the tracking incessantly. Then, late morning, the books moved from Hamburg, and to my complete shock, they were on their way to an airport in UK. That's when I panicked. I immediately called the courier and asked for confirmation that I would receive the books at least just before the launch. At this point, the courier gave me no more assurances except that the packages will get to its destination eventually. I also got mhux int ħallejt għall-aħħar. That the exact comfort I was looking for at the moment. On suspense. The night before, and this is the night before the launch, I had thought of a plan B, but it was too far-fetched. However, now, at this desperate moment, I had very little options except to resort to my crazy plan. With no guarantees from the courier, I called Air Malta and booked the Friday morning flight to Rome, with a return flight out on the same day. I also called the printer and implored him to meet me at the arrivals of Fiumicino Airport and give me 2 boxes of the book. I would then rush back to the plane and make it to Malta, hopefully in time. In my hysteria, though, I had not calculated that the drive from Florence to Fiumicino was almost 3 hours, 6 hours including the return, and that I had to go through customs, find my printer, carry the boxes through check-in and security, and that, above all, each box weighed 60 kilos. I believe the printer tried to explain all this, but in my panic, his only option was to do as I told him, and we agreed to meet at the arrivals. In the meantime, I was still monitoring tracking in the hope that the books would move and start their way to Malta. But it seems it was stuck, and it remained there even after my pleas to the local agents to have it moved or suffer the ire of the President of Malta. It still remained there. I also informed Quentin and Conrad of what I am about to do, and still remember that Quentin was amused, while Conrad was somewhat more preoccupied. However, they were both so very understanding. I assume my body language and Katav-looking color was speaking volumes for me. On Friday morning, before going to the airport, I checked again the whereabouts of the package. They were still there. I had no option but to execute Plan B. And as it happens, as soon as I found my seat on the plane, my sister calls from the office informing me the books had arrived. Apparently, something had gone wrong with the tracking system. At this point, there was no turning back. I was fastened to the airplane seat, and the printer was halfway from Florence to Rome. I still remember the steward on that flight, though. To my relief, it was an old friend of mine, Godwin Gregg. I told him the reason of my travel and implored him not to fly out without me or the books. On arrival, I rushed to meet the printer, but as expected, could only lift one box. Somehow, I made my way back to the plane through check-in and security, and made it back to Malta. Finally, I had a book for the book launch. For that night, I just had 36 books. They were all sold, obviously. But for that night, my adventure in Rome took pride of place, much to the amusement of Quentin and our guests. Thank you very much. One last note. I also thank my dear friend Stephen Spiteri for kickstarting again the project on the second edition of the book. Thank you.
I'm afraid this is going to be an anticlimax after all this high drama. For my short intervention, I wanted to talk about, Quentin, both as a friend and as a mentor. I knew Quentin personally towards the twilight years of his career and life, but obviously he had a major influence on my work even to this very day, and I have very fond memories of him, and I constantly keep him in mind even in my current research. So what I'm going to share with you are personal reminiscences, and although they might look fragmented reflections and thoughts, I hope that they have meaning and value to you. So it all started a bit before what Joe was saying, when through Richard England I got this phone call saying that this was around 2001, that the great Professor Quentin Hughes would like to meet you. And obviously, knowing that Quentin was an institution, through his books, I had never met him. I was still a young graduate coming back from my studies in North America. So the event was set. I had to meet him for supper at the then Coastline Hotel, which is no longer in existence, in Salina. He was accompanied by his young daughter then, Alice, I believe. And we met, and he was extremely, I was a certain degree of trepidation meeting him, but he was very reassuring, and he said, I've got something for you, he said. And he gave me a copy of the Liverpool book, not Seaport, the Gazetteer. And he said, I'll give you this book on one condition. And here, I'll give you this book on the basis that we'll do a similar one, a Gazetteer on Malta. So I said, yes, fine. But all of a sudden, the obligation, that, I had to honor basically my pledge then was already bearing on my shoulders. But they were very pleasant supper. And then he said, okay, I'll contact my publisher back in Liverpool and we'll start working on it. So we started doing some work, and then, 2-3 months later, he said, I've got some bad news. My publisher in Liverpool has cold feet. He thinks that this might not sell well in the UK, so I don't know what we're going to do. And here comes basically Paul, the late Paul Mizzi, and Joe, his son,
who I happened to accidentally meet him and said, I have an idea, I have a project. There's this possibility. And Paul Mizzi was very enthusiastic about it. And then, as Joe told you, then the story continues. So this is to put some visual. This is basically Malta, the Baroque island, the book we've been talking about. This is the actual launch of the book in St. James Church. Daniel Celia, myself, Quentin, President Guido De Marco, Richard England, Paul Mizzi, Mariella Pesani-Bencini was the compere, and a very different Joe Mizzi. Actually, it was an extremely, very, the choice, basically. I mean, we had the idea of having it in St. James Church, Carapecchia's, kind of one of Carapecchia's masterpieces, was something that really Quentin enjoyed. The actual fact that we're seated at the altar, obviously, apparently with some clergymen, apparently didn't go extremely well, but we managed to, kind of twist a few arms and get the authorities to allow us to have the book launch there. And I remember still to this day a very eloquent speech by His Excellency Guido De Marco, who was had a cultural baggage of knowledge and made a memorable speech. And here we see Richard England presenting our book to Quentin, presenting the book. Quentin basically here talking the presentation of the book to President Guido De Marco, and coverage of the book basically in the local press here in front of the Auberge de Castile. Quentin always had a knack of, even though we used to correspond digitally, by that time, there was already emails, and Quentin was a very technologically advanced man, in keeping with technology at the time, embraced technology, but every now and then at salient milestones, he would write you a formal letter, kind of acknowledging here, so this is a letter which I treasure and keep, basically thanking us for our collaboration and that he really enjoyed working with me, and something that would basically stand out as a very personal momentum. And after that, the success of that book, and we really enjoyed the collaboration, we thought maybe we have a second volume now that would cover the British period from 1800 till 2000. So we started working on that. Unfortunately, he got ill, very ill in the first few months. He had already sent me some information, some writings, but then I felt that I owed it to Quentin that this book would eventually continue, would crystallize, even with all its imperfections, because I had to bear the brunt of doing most of the writings, but hopefully, he forgives me for any inaccuracies. So the second companion volume, Malta War and Peace, an Architectural Chronicle, was there. And I still remember him worrying. He said, well, I hope it will do as well as the first one, because obviously the topic, Architecture of the Nights, is more saleable, more marketable than the second volume. So he really even showed concern regarding the publishers in terms of economic viability. I'm also very pleased that there were 3 of us who then nominated Quentin for the National Award of Merit, Professor Richard England, myself, and someone who, forgive me, I forgot who it was. And we thought he really deserved that, and we were very happy that the National Order of Merit was awarded to him in 2003, something which he really, truly, deeply appreciated. Now, on a personal note, a year before he passed away, well, Quentin is the father figure, the pioneer in terms of Maltese architectural historiography. The first scientific formal book written about architectural history is The Building of Malta, 1956, which even by today's standards is obviously very dated. You still see the very critical eye and analysis of how Quentin approached buildings. So he called me in a year before he passed away. He said, I'm going to give you something special, which I hope you will cherish and treasure. And he gave me the manuscript of all his handwritten notes and sketches and photographs when he was compiling the book, The Building of Malta. And on the frontispiece, he wrote, written originally in the 1950s, in May 2003, I thought it appropriate, here there's a correction, that these notes should reside in Malta. And so I've given them to my great friend and colleague, Conrad Thake. Signed, J. Quentin Hughes, 6th of May, 2003. These notes are very revealing. These are a sample of some of the notes. It's a collage, a collection of handwritten notes, field notes, doing his own freehand sketches there and making a number of very astute observations. And the degree of detail that he went into is amazing. You could see that he would dissect, almost x-ray the facade of a building, annotate it deeply, draw the plan, make observations through every single, from Baroque churches to medieval chapels to palaces. And most of these, even though now, by the time building of Malta was built, we didn't know yet about Carapecchia, about Mondion, about Bonamici. They were still unknown to us as historians. But the value of the way he analyzed the buildings, the way he studied plans, the configuration of space, the proportions of the facade is still very valid today. So I still, even because of the advice, still consult the building of Malta whenever I want to look at a formal analysis of building. For example, take this case here. He's studying notes on the magisterial palace, and out of the whole palace, the huge palace, his concern is the lower bottom part. Studying, he measured every single part of the chamfered coins at the corner, the detailing, and dissecting it in great detail and placing it there to understand the typology of rusticated coins in Renaissance palaces, and so forth. This is analysis of the Zabouch parish church, drawing the plan, drawing the details of the cornice and the moldings and the voting system that there is. He had this very analytical, it was balance between archival research and then empirical research, the power of observation and seeing things through his eyes. This is actually a photograph taken by Daniel Cilia when we were working at the book on Malta Baroque Island, taken in Zabouch, where the photograph is being photographed. So there's Quentin taking a photograph of me, and Daniel somewhere, obviously invisible, taking a photograph of ours. I will always remember Quentin. I mean, basically there are so many testimonials to his achievements as a scholar, as a mentor, as a war hero, but I really concur with what Stephen Spiteri said regarding his modesty, humility, and even great sensitivity on a humane level. On a personal level, I remember, when once we had met together with my wife and Maria, that two then very young sons, Edward and Andrew. They were then aged 5 and 7. And my younger son was doodling, doing a little drawing and sketch. And all of a sudden, this was pre-Euro coins. He took out a meril, a £1, a 1 coin, 1 lira coin, and he said, "Young man, this is the first drawing you've sold." And he took it there and gave him the £1. And you could see my 5-year-old son, his ego was over the moon. That evening, he phoned me, and we were discussing, business in terms of books. And then towards the end, he said, "Conrad, please do tell your other son, the older son, that if he also does a drawing for me, I will also give him £1. So I mean that shows the humanity of such a person to really go into these details. His humanity, which is really something that I really appreciated. I want to conclude with this character kind of trip appreciation written by Stephen Bailey that was published in The Guardian, which really sums up Quentin. Quentin was learned and stylish, but most of all, he was a characterful individual who always made you feel that life was that little bit more interesting than you had already suspected. He always had good furniture, interesting cars, and lots of talkative friends. There was always a decent bottle of wine and something to read. Quentin always joked about the SAS motto of "Who dares wins." He said it really should be "Who cares who wins?" For me, J.Q. Hughes, JQH won most of the important stuff. Thank you.
Thank you once again, all the speakers have given a very good delivery and giving us different aspects of this gentleman, Quentin Hughes. And before coming to an end, I would like to invite Mrs. Jo Hughes to say a few words. Thank you.
I know I leave the microphone down, but thanks. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, and thank you for inviting me to close this session. I don't have anything prepared, but I'd just like to thank everybody who's contributed and thank everyone who's come. And it's just been a wonderful occasion for me to hear all these accolades about Quentin. So thank you very much.
In case no one has anything to ask about Quentin, maybe we said a bit too much. Or, well, there are his books that attest his greatness, and I really thank you for spending this morning with us. I thank the University of Malta for coming up with this idea, the contributors, Phoenicia as well, who has helped to make this occasion possible, and really we thank you from our heart at Palazzo Falson for always supporting our events. Thank you, and